Hi, my name is N1 Beat and Osu.
So typically the intros to these types of videos are more cinematic or dramatic or something along those lines, but because I'm not good at making good intros, I've been playing Osu for 6 years now. Or at least just under 6 years at the time of recording this. I should be at the 6-year mark by the time this video comes out though. And even now as I write the script, it still feels kinda crazy to think about. I've been thinking about this specifically for the past few months, as I've started thinking about a lot of things I've done up until this point, especially after watching Phonehunter's video in which he discussed his own history. I originally wanted to do this video for my 5-year anniversary, but I ended up doing a general year reflection instead, since I wanted to go over the things I did that year and feel happy about those moments specifically. That isn't to say that I didn't feel the same about this year either, it's just more that this video is pretty well overdue in my book. Now you might be wondering who the hell I am. And to that I say, hello, my online alias is Nightbeat, spelled with a 1 because I am the coolest person alive, of course. I am currently around 4,300 on the global rankings, and as I've stated earlier, I've been playing Osu for 6 years now, with somewhere around 880 hours of recorded playtime. My main motivators to play the game can vary from time to time, but one of my more prominent motivators is playing tournaments, whether it be solo or team tournaments. Whenever I actually get invited, that is. I've had the opportunity to do a lot of things I wanted to do this year, both inside and outside of Osu, but in this video, I'm going to focus more on things I've done within Osu, and reflect to whatever extent I can on all my experiences up until now. Of course, I might end up excluding some details mostly out of not being able to remember them that well, but I'll do my best to summarize what I can. But without further ado, here's some random Asian guy on the internet having an existential crisis revolving around a circle-clicking rhythm game. My early years of Osu are a bit foggy in my head, to be completely honest. There's a lot of details I can't particularly remember, or at least are somewhat out of order, but I first remember being exposed to Osu around the tail end of 2016. I got a video in my YouTube recommended by BTMC titled "And Some Say He Never Played Osu Again." I'm sure a lot of people watching this know what this video is, but in short, it was a live play on the map titled The Big Black in which BTMC failed on the last spinner after missing a bunch on the final stream. I'm not quite sure what it was about this video that caught my attention. Maybe it was laughing from his reaction of pure disbelief, or the game looking like something I've never seen before. But regardless, it sparked my interest in the game and I looked more into it on YouTube. As I searched more and more, I also discovered some of Wobblewolf's videos. I think a lot of his influence on me had to do with how almost seamlessly he seemed to play the game, in combination with how he seemed to really have fun when playing it. Regardless of what exactly it was though, I continued to watch more videos, and eventually on January 1st, 2017, I registered for an account and downloaded Osu. During my first 2 or 3 months, I remember being enamored with having high accuracy FCs. Well, maybe obsessed is more accurate. A lot of my earlier replays that I still have uploaded involve the use of mods such as Sudden Death or Perfect. The former enforcing that the player doesn't miss or break, and the latter enforcing that the player doesn't drop their accuracy from 100%. Sometimes it would also involve the use of other difficulty increasing mods such as Hidden or even Hard Rock. I'd be disappointed whenever I got a play with accuracy below 99% and tried the map over and over again until I got a play I was satisfied with, and it reflects somewhat in my play graph. And while that specific playstyle didn't necessarily last me that long, maybe 4 or 5 months, a lot of the habits I picked up from it still stuck with me, and even still do to this day to some extent, albeit maybe a bit less extreme. It didn't help that I felt like I took things a bit too seriously back then. It wasn't that I thought I was playing at a high level or anything, but I think it was a lot more like I was just way too mature for my own age, especially in hindsight. I also played a lot with autopilot and relax. I'm not really too sure why I did, but I guess I saw it as impressive. I can't really say whether it helped me too much at improving, if really at all. I was also decently interested in streaming pretty early on in my quote-unquote career. I first streamed about halfway into the year when I had my own room and an actual PC with an overlay I made myself. It's not really the greatest. Though, in my defense, I didn't really know much, if anything, about GFX at the time, so don't roast me from 5 years ago too hard. Anyways, nothing really that notable happened when I streamed, but I was able to meet a handful of people through doing so. Hey, wait a minute, that guy seems familiar. Honestly, in hindsight, I'm pretty grateful I never got popular or anything along those lines, especially since I seemed pretty obnoxious back then. But I suppose that's how everyone feels about their younger selves. I raged and got mad at myself a lot, which I guess also hasn't really changed that much nowadays, but I got a lot more mad at myself and was generally a lot harder on myself. I think at the time, I really wanted to become good or well known in some way, probably because I had 0 friends in real life and never went outside. Wait a minute, why are there so many things that are still the same? That's also what probably influenced my decision to try my hand at tournaments. I'm not even really sure how I got exposed to tournaments in the first place. Some of the World Cups probably caught my attention, I guess. I believed myself to be at least above average for the players around my rank at the time and, I wanted to give it a try. I signed up as a free agent for my first tournament in July 2017 and got invited to a team, as well as a solo tournament in the same month. The results were disappointing, to say the least. I don't think I got a single win in either of the 2 tournaments I played, and I think I played pretty mediocre during those matches too. In hindsight, a good part of me wishes I held off on tournaments for just a bit longer. I wouldn't say I was completely out of my depth or anything like that, but I definitely wasn't good or even decent by any means. But I'm probably being a lot harder on myself now than I probably should be. It definitely doesn't help that all the MPs and spreadsheets are dead. I didn't even really know how I wanted to approach tournaments at the time either, which actually makes sense considering that I played my first tournament like 6 months after I started playing the game. Perhaps I could have had an alright performance in my early years of tournaments if I had waited a bit longer and developed more, but who really knows. Other than that though, I felt like 2017 was pretty alright for a first year. Got my first 6-star FC in November of that year, with my first 6-star pass being in August, I believe, as well as my first 7-star pass, with about 15,000 play count total at the end of the year. I do also believe my rank was around 20,000 at the end of the year, which I was pretty happy with overall. That being said though, I was 377,000 in February of that year, so take that as you will. Regardless, a pretty good amount of improvement in my eyes, and I'm very much happy to have had a good first year. Yes, I'm well aware of how much more optimistic this part was compared to the last part. Be ready for a good amount of that. Throughout 2017, I've watched OSU streamers a lot, especially BTMC. Now you might be asking, what does watching BTMC have to do with anything in this segment? Well, the only tournament I ended up playing in 2018, or at least as far as I can remember, was with a few people who I believe were active in his community at the time, with a team consisting of Vigma, Sunfire, Science Lolly, Meowsha, and Doofy. It was there that I won my first tournament match. We still went 1 and 2 in groups, but hey, a win is a win. That aside, I wasn't really as active in 2018 than I was in the previous year, but still decently active. If I recall correctly, I mostly focused on farming PP scores and going up in the ranks this year, as well as going for scores that I thought would be neat. I went from 19k with about 4.4k PP to about 6.3k with about 5.9k PP in June that year, while getting both my first 300 and 400 PP plays. I ultimately finished the year out at 5.1k, peaking somewhere around 4.9 in October. I ultimately finished the year out at 5.1k, while peaking at somewhere around 4.9k in October. And as a result of wanting to go up in the ranks, I started playing harder maps with Hard Rock and Double Time. The former I've played a bit on easier maps, the latter I haven't really played much if at all. I had also been learning hitting in I had also been playing Hidden a decent amount even up until that point, so I decided to also put that on for most of the maps as well. I streamed a decent amount throughout the year, both Osu and some other games. I also ended up getting a better overlay about halfway into the year. Shout out to Eliza / apathy / whatever the hell your username is nowadays for the overlay. That is, if you're even actually watching this. I think at some point I was stressing about streaming more and getting popular or more well known in that way, but to be perfectly honest, I'm still glad that I never did. Still find it kind of funny though. I remember getting down about it pretty often. It wasn't really evident in my everyday life, but it was definitely more prevalent online, such as when I did stream. I do also remember being active in a handful of other Osu-focused communities sometime during this year as well. Doing so exposed me to a player called Medicals, who improved pretty fast. I was pretty jealous of them for a good amount of time, to tell you the truth, since they surpassed my rank pretty quickly, maybe a bit salty even, but I'm very much happy for them nowadays and even look up to them somewhat nowadays. This year was a lot better than I probably felt at the time, especially so with hindsight bias and all that. Looking through all my VODs from that year, I got mad at myself a lot and ended up ending streams due to tilting, despite improving a lot through the year as well. I feel like I was setting my expectations for myself pretty high on a constant basis, while not really having clear goals in mind to actually improve. But hey, it's all in the past now, and it was during a period of time where I was a lot more immature. 2019 is when things start to get a bit less foggy and more familiar to me. Unfortunately, I have maybe 5 videos total that I can use for this segment. Following tradition from the previous year, my play count was less in total this year than the previous year. I think this somewhat reflected in my rank throughout the year, as while I did end up reaching my peak rank at 4.4k, I wound up hovering around the 5k mark and ended up finishing the year at 5.9k. I do believe I played offline a handful of times though, plus I started playing a few other games more often. Regardless though, despite having a good amount of drought periods for scores, I still got a good handful of decent scores. I ended up playing about 5 tournaments total throughout the year. My first tournament that year was a tournament called Osu Caterpillar Cup spin-off Sunflower vs Cherry Blossom, which happened during February. I know, that name just rolls right off the tongue. This was definitely one of my more memorable tournaments even up till this day. The format had it so that players would play solo qualifiers, who would then partner up with another player. From then on, there would be 2 separate brackets where teams that beat each other would get to take players from the losing team and advance with said players. I ended up qualifying as the 31st seed and getting partnered up with TJ7223, as neither of us ended up finding a partner. We averaged out to end up as the second lowest seed in the Cherry Blossom bracket, which meant we had to face the second highest team in our first match, Bob Schmerda and Dreary, and despite the seed advantage, we still managed to win it out in tiebreaker. It made me pretty happy to win that match, especially as a duo who basically ended up being partnered together by default. And then we lost our other match and I ended up getting not picked. Darn. The only other real notable tournament for me that year was my very first USA States Cup. Yes, that's the tournament name, and no, I'm not having a stroke. Or at least I think I'm not. I played for Team Maryland, and the roster consisted of Leotic, Big Boob, Kodama, Minus, and Monko2K. Kind of a pretty good roster. Unfortunately, I only ended up playing one map, which was our first map of the tournament against New Jersey. It wasn't even really because the team wouldn't let me or anything like that. If anything, they were more than willing to let me play a map if I really wanted to. But when the lowest score on their team ends up having almost double the score you get, you can kind of imagine how I ended up being discouraged. Maybe being discouraged from playing maps for the entire tournament was a bit too much, but what can you do, I guess. We still managed to get top 6, but obviously no thanks to me. If I was given a choice to go back in time and replay one tournament regardless of any conditions regarding my skill, it would probably be this one. I still had a good amount of fun though. It was nice being able to play with people I sort of saw as role models and get an idea of where I wanted to be in terms of skill. Even then, it was sort of difficult for me to really gauge how good I was in comparison to players around me, and I always wanted to know how I placed out of other players in my state, so I was pretty happy to participate in this. I don't think I really fully understood this at the time, but it definitely went to show me how important my own confidence is when it comes to playing tournaments. To be honest, I wasn't that confident going into the second match of OCC, and it definitely showed as I wound up underperforming on a lot of maps in the actual match. And I don't think I need to elaborate how my confidence wound up being displayed in USC either, or at least lack thereof. In hindsight, I kinda wish that I thought more about confidence and my mental more, especially as I'm only recently starting to change things up mentally, but what can you do, I guess. Tournaments aside, I also got to meet some OSU people in real life. I met a friend named Steph from Serbia and New York and got to play at an internet cafe. We didn't really get to do much, but it was nice meeting someone who I was friends with from overseas. I also got to attend 2 Maryland meetups later on in the year, where I met some of the people that played USC and a few others in Maryland. It was honestly pretty cool being able to meet some of these players, especially, as I said earlier, I looked up to some of them as players and still do to this day. That being said though, I think my motivation started tapering off towards the end of that year. I kept setting my expectations high, which wasn't necessarily bad for what I was doing, but my tournament results just did not back that up at all. I didn't qualify for the 2 solo tournaments that had qualifiers, and I went 0-3 in the group stage of the other solo tournament I had. But regardless, getting to meet and talk to more people makes up for that in my mind. Could have been a better year for me, but hey, it wasn't anywhere near the absolute worst. Speaking of the absolute worst.
Oh my god, bro.
Oh, hell no, man. What the fuck?
Alright, well, 2020 is a year that needs no introduction for, well, any of us. I could go on a whole rant about quarantine and how it affected all of us, but I'm sure you've heard it hundreds of times. I don't usually wish that I could forget an entire year, but I do low-key wish I could just forget this year. The first few months of the year were alright to be honest, though my computer ended up breaking in February. Thankfully, I still had a decent laptop I could use for gaming. I had like 800 play count in March, which was the highest I've ever had since October 2018. But in May, I only ended up having a 2-digit play count with a total of 42 plays. I don't think I was even playing offline that year either. It went back up the following few months, but stagnated a bit afterwards since I decided to start focusing a bit more on getting used to virtual classes. Regardless, I ended up decaying a pretty large amount. You don't typically lose that much ranks per day when you decay in 4-digit, maybe like 5 or 6 per day on average, but I went from around 5.9k at the beginning of the year, all the way down to 8.1k by late December. Granted, it wasn't as if players really had anything better to do than, well, play the game at the time, but that's still over 2.1k ranks, and in my case, even more than that. I didn't really play many tournaments this year either, with all 5 of them being in the first half of the year, and they left a lot to be desired to say the least. I never got far in any of them due to underperforming, and this unfortunately also translated to the team tournaments I played. Despite that though, I spent most of my time in tournaments this year as a commentator slash streamer, with almost all of my commentating experience being from tournaments that year. Pretty interesting to think about, but makes a lot more sense considering quarantine and all that, I suppose. I blocked a pretty good amount of this year just completely out of my brain to tell you the truth, as in I'm genuinely blanking out when it comes down to trying to remember some things. Even after looking through all my screenshots, it felt like the year never even really happened, even though 1, it did happen, and 2, I have evidence of events happening during that year in the form of screenshots, shadow plays, etc., which I'm pretty sure many of us can relate to as well. I felt really burnt out about playing the game for a good portion of that year. I wouldn't say there was an exact period of time in which I was burnt out, since I feel like my burnout tends to be tentative at best, but the periods of burnout I felt during that year felt worse than any other year. I think this year showed me how important having good or at least positive mental was when it came to playing Osu, and really influenced me to pay more attention to my own mental health. Ultimately, I was just happy to survive this whole ordeal with my family, but it was nice having more time to talk and play games with my friends during quarantine. It made things a lot more bearable than it probably would have been without them. Following suit from wanting to change, I feel like 2021 is the year where I started taking a few steps to have a more positive outlook and a better mentality. Or at least I'm pretty sure it was. I don't know, my entire timeline feels messed up after 2020. To make up for how little I played in 2020, I started playing a pretty decent amount in 2021, at least in the latter half of the year. I was still trying to get used to online classes for the first half of the year, and focused more on closing all of that out. During that time though, I got to attend one of the Northern Virginia meetups hosted at the K Fairfax in Fairfax, Virginia, throughout late March to early April, I believe. There weren't a great deal of people there, but it was nice being able to talk to people and friends face to face for once, even with masks and COVID restrictions and all. I ended up getting to meet BTMC as well, which was also pretty exciting for me since I've looked up to him for a good amount of time. Pretty hard to assume, isn't it? There was also a LAN one that was hosted there, but we don't talk about that. Well, except for this clip.
You want me to sit on you?
I also got to attend another Maryland meetup in October, with a lot more people than I think any of us were anticipating. There's a LAN tournament there as well, and I managed to get top 3 by virtue of bringing an actual PC and winning the 3rd place decider by default because my opponent had to leave early. Not my proudest $4, but I mean $4 is $4. Also, as a result of not playing much in the first half of the year, I wound up decaying all the way back to 5-digit by early July, which meant that I was just a month short for being eligible to participate in the 5-digit World Cup because of a rule that required that players be within the rank range at the beginning of registrations. Truly a tragedy. That aside, I started setting the bulk of my scores from this year towards the latter half of the year. I think my motivation started to go up as I learned that there were more reworks coming, also aided by me eventually building my current PC in July of that year. There was a rework in August where I gained about 600 ranks and another one in November where I shot up 1.8k ranks. I started pushing my general consistency more and started dabbling more in speed and stamina. I also managed to get my first 7-star FC during this year, which was a goal I chased pretty hard that year. I even remember compiling a bunch of replays that I choked up until that point into a single video. Felt pretty nice to get it, especially considering that it was on a map that I choked back in 2020. Though I have some mixed feelings with how I went about it. Not my proudest 7-star FC, but it was my first, so who really cares? My tournament performances weren't really anything to write home about though. I got invited to a few team tournaments, but we didn't really end up qualifying for them. I did play 2 additional solo tournaments though, one of which I actually managed to qualify for, only to lose both my matches after that. Speaking of tournaments though, 4WC tryouts also happened in December, which I used as an opportunity to see how I fared against players in my general rank range. In hindsight, a part of me wishes that I practiced some maps more and pushed myself to play them, since I ended up getting 41st out of 47 total players. I don't think it really would have increased my chances of making the team much if at all, but I think I'd be a lot more happy with my final result if I did. I would touch more about this year as a whole, but I've already made a video in which I sort of recap 2021 as a whole for me, albeit from a more general perspective. My overall outlook at the time is that I wanted to improve myself and become more consistent at what I felt I was good at, and I'd say I did a pretty okay job at doing that. Pretty decent year overall. Also, I only now did remember this for 2020/2021, but I did also host 2 tournaments during that time, I believe. Those were more community focused though, and I'm not too sure if I actually want to like talk about them much. And now here we are at 2022. I think overall 2022 has to be my best year to date, even though that sounds pretty obvious and applies to most people. It's definitely helped a lot that I've had a few more clear goals in mind, though they can tend to vary from what I'm doing and what I want to do at the time. I think my overall motivation was just way higher this year than it ever has been. It definitely helped that I got a new top play in mid-January, as well as reaching 8k PP overall. I've been stuck in the 7k PP range for a good while up until that point, and now I'm just a few plays away from reaching 9k PP, at least at the time of writing the script. Okay, so it's been like a week or so since I wrote this part, and I can confirm that I have indeed reached the 9k PP mark. Pretty cool, I think. I've been setting plays that I've sort of seen as quote-unquote dream plays, if you will, during my first 2 years or so of playing, on maps such as like Zetspo Plantation or Furious and Melodia. Quite the range of maps between those two, I know, but you get what I mean. In addition to these plays, I've also just been going for plays that I've generally seen as cool plays, all of which should be uploaded, I believe, as replays. I've also been starting to focus a bit more on skill sets that I might not be as strong at this year, especially in tournaments. I've been pushing my hidden abilities, still lacking severely in the reading department though, as well as my overall hard rock consistency to some extent. I'd like to believe it's been helping with my placings, but that's also kinda hard for me to really determine for myself, but I feel like it's been helping. I also remember planning on uploading content and streaming more at the beginning of the year, and while I feel I was doing a pretty decent job for the first few months, it's been not as decent ever since. It feels like a majority of the videos I uploaded this year have just been replays as opposed to actual scripted videos, or even just clips from my stream, which is probably somewhat accurate. Didn't help that basically the only times I streamed, it was just for my tournament matches. Kinda sucks that I never wound up sticking to any of the uploading plans I set for myself, but what can you do, I guess. But hey, as I said, I did stream more often by virtue of streaming my tournament matches, but not really much outside of that. Speaking of which, on top of playing more tournaments this year, I've been getting a good amount of decent placings in them, a considerable step up from my previous performances. So I guess me practicing other skills has helped. At the time of writing this, I've played and finished a total of 14 tournaments this year. My best placing to date is getting second in a server-oriented tournament called Copper's World Cup 2, excluding the Maryland Tandem Land where I got first with Minus, if you want to count that, as well as top 6 finishes in 2 public tournaments. I've also been working on just finding stuff that's comfortable, as well as working on bad habits that I have, both in how I play and what I think when I play. I'd like to think I've been making decent progress in that regard, but I definitely still have a lot to work on. I found that my mental tends to be pretty inconsistent at times. Sometimes I have weeks where I just have a bunch of confidence in myself, but other weeks where I feel a bit less confident about myself. But ultimately, I've also just learned to be way more confident in myself when matches come around. Practicing map pools has helped a good amount with this, even if it's just running through them once on a Wednesday. That being said though, I'm trying to convince myself to practice them more than once, at least for the later stages. I've sort of found that I can play early stage map pools generally well without too much practice, but when I end up getting to the later stages, I tend to fall off in that regard. I feel like I'm not setting my expectations too high to the point where I feel like I can't reach them, but still high enough to ground myself in where I feel I should be. I think I've also become a lot better at generally controlling my nerves when it comes to tournaments, at least when it comes to at least when it comes to the match as a whole. For example, if I'm leading in the match, I won't feel that nervous, but I still definitely get nervous on a map-to-map basis, and I also need to try and work on that more. Of course, as I've mentioned earlier, I still have a lot of things in my mentality to work on. Motivation can be pretty hard for me sometimes, even if I have clear goals in mind, and I still get mad at myself a lot for not performing up to my standards. Whenever that does happen though, I tend to just try and vent it out or just relax by listening to music or something, which isn't bad by any means, but I feel like it'll be more beneficial for me to learn how to utilize that frustration and feel it towards motivating myself. But hey, maybe I'm just overthinking mental concepts in a pretty straightforward circle clicking video game. One thing I know is that I'm not really too sure what kind of player I am. I'd like to believe I'm a well-rounded player, but I still don't really know much about what I excel at. I'm pretty confident in my aim and overall consistency, but I still have a lot of gaps when it comes to things I'm not so great at. My ult can be pretty on and off, as well as my hard rock consistency, and my speed and stamina can fill the quota a few times in earlier stages, but they can tend to be lackluster at later stages. Looking back at how I've edited this video, there's a lot of clips that show a lot of flow aim type of stuff, but even my flow aim's pretty on and off sometimes. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the progress I've made as a whole, even if I don't outwardly express it often. I've started being able to get decent scores on maps that I thought were just flat out impossible back then. I like to believe I've had a decent amount of potential that I just haven't tapped into until recently, but again, I don't even know that for myself, to be honest. And that's about it for my recap of my previous years of OSU, at least for now. Realistically speaking, I don't think I'd consider actually quitting until I've won a badge tournament at the very least, but I still have a pretty long way to go when it comes down to this specifically, as I've probably said 5,000 times now. I might experiment a bit more with my playstyle going forward to find something that's more comfortable for me. That isn't to say my current playstyle isn't comfortable or anything like that, but I'd like to see how much better I can make it for myself. I don't think I see myself fully changing my playstyle for a good while though. The only two changes I see myself doing are readjusting my keybinds, which are currently G and R, and maybe experimenting with a new area. There's still a lot of pretty bad habits that I still haven't fully shaken off when it comes to my mentality. I feel like I'm still comparing myself to players way too much in a negative way, as well as just putting myself down way too often. To be fair, these typically happen during late nights, but it's not uncommon during the day too. I also need to learn not to tilt as often. Typically when I do vent out that frustration, I tend to feel better afterwards, which is nice and all, but I feel like I shouldn't be getting as frustrated as I do, or at least as often as I do. But that isn't to say I don't feel confident in myself about overcoming these, of course. I've slowly been starting to embrace the whole idea of just moving on and finding ways to better myself, as well as just starting to care about myself as a whole. I've been exercising and stretching more as of recently, which I feel has also been helping with motivating myself and being more positive about myself overall. Mental side of things aside, regardless of how long I've been playing and how long it's taken me to do so and so, I'm happy to have been able to accomplish what I have so far. Even if it isn't really much in the grand scheme of things, it just feels incredible being able to do things I saw as almost impossible back then. If you were to tell 2017 me that I'd be the player I am today, I don't think I'd believe you at all. I'm also very grateful to have met the people I have throughout the years. I've had the pleasure of being able to talk and compete with many incredible people within the community. Maybe not within the greater community, but you get my point. It's also been incredible watching the people around me develop into better players, even if I don't really talk with them as much. I'd list them all, but I'd be here all day if I did that. Going forward in terms of what kind of player I want to be a player that's pretty decently well-rounded without a great deal of weaknesses that aren't absolutely glaring. I think it goes without saying that it's almost impossible to be a true all-rounder, but I'd love to keep developing and see where I end up. I probably already fit this quota to be honest, but as I said, I want to continue pushing it and see where I get. I think I'd also like to be a player that can motivate and coach other players around me, especially since I've been becoming more interested in psychology and how and why people think recently. And well, if I can't reach incredible heights, I might as well take as much credit for somebody's fame as possible by saying that I helped someone reaching said heights. Jokes aside, I want to be able to give pointers to players that might be struggling or don't really know how to progress. As someone who's historically had a pretty bad mentality and been stuck as a result, I can relate pretty hard to how bad people may feel as a result. And I don't want people to feel that way because at its core, this game is just a pretty fun circle-clicking rhythm game with some pretty neat songs, as well as some pretty cool people. I've thought many times about just flat out quitting because of how terrible I felt about myself and what felt like the little progress I was making. Had I done so, I wouldn't be where I am today, obviously. The last thing I'd want is people that feel the same as I did going through with actually quitting the game. Because God knows what kind of progress or experiences they'd actually make if they continued playing. I'm not really sure what'll end up happening down the line. Maybe I'll hit an insane improvement spike and become the ideal player I've always wanted to be, or I'll just stagnate for a good while. Maybe I'll win a tournament or two, or maybe even none at all. The believer in me would hope for the best, but I'm not sure how realistic that'd be. Either way, I'm looking forward to seeing what comes and goes. Thank you to all the people who I've met throughout this journey. Thank you to all of those who have motivated me to better myself, whether it be directly or indirectly. And finally, thank you for actually sitting through this video for whatever godforsaken reason. I'm looking forward to another year of playing this game and maybe more to come. Who really knows? Thanks for watching again, and I'll see you next time. Whenever I actually decide to record and edit a video, that is.